Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're settling into bed, curling up on the couch, or just winding down after a long day, this is a quiet corner where history meets curiosity and where the big questions of politics are explored gently, thoughtfully, without the noise. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that shapes nations, alters lives, and sometimes changes the course of history with nothing more than a signature. We're talking about executive power. The authority of one person, sitting in one office, to issue orders that ripple across an entire country. It's a power that's been used to free enslaved people, to intern innocent citizens, to protect civil rights, and to spark fierce debates about what a president can and cannot do. Now, I do hope this journey is relaxing enough to help you drift off, but if it happens to be a little too interesting, well, at least you'll learn something about how American democracy works, or doesn't work, depending on who you ask. Before we begin, if you enjoy these slow explorations of history and politics, I'd be grateful if you tapped the like button, subscribed, or even just left a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. It helps this quiet little channel grow. All right, take a deep breath, settle in. Let's begin our gentle voyage into the story of the pen, the presidency, and the fragile balance of power. Picture this. It's a quiet morning in the Oval Office. Sunlight filters through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. On the desk sits a single document, crisp and formal, waiting. A president picks up a pen, black ink gleaming in the light, and with a few strokes of their hand, signs their name at the bottom of the page. No debate, no vote, no lengthy congressional hearing, just a signature. And with that simple act, the rules change. Maybe it's an order to protect public lands. Maybe it's a directive to restrict immigration. Maybe it's a command to deploy troops, or to freeze funding, or to reverse a policy that's been in place for decades. The details vary, but the mechanism is the same. One person, wielding the power of the executive branch, can reshape the legal landscape of a nation in an instant. This is the world of executive orders, presidential memoranda, and proclamations, tools that have existed since the founding of the Republic, yet remain some of the most controversial and misunderstood aspects of American governance. But here's the question that hangs in the air, quiet and persistent. How much power should one person have? And when does the stroke of a pen cross the line from leadership to overreach? To understand where we are today, we have to go back, way back, to a time when the presidency itself was a new and uncertain experiment, and the very idea of executive power made people nervous. The year is 1789. The Constitution has just been ratified, the ink is barely dry, and George Washington, a man who never really wanted the job, finds himself sitting in what would become the most powerful office in the world. But here's the thing. The Constitution is remarkably vague about what a president can actually do. It says the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It grants command of the military. It allows for treaties and appointments, with the advice and consent of the Senate. But beyond that, it's mostly silence. The framers did this on purpose. They'd just fought a war to escape a king. They weren't about to create another one, so they left the presidency intentionally ambiguous, a role to be defined not by the document but by the person holding it. Washington understood this. He moved carefully, aware that every decision he made would set a precedent, and one of his earliest acts was to issue what we now recognize as the first executive order, though it wasn't called that at the time. In 1789, he instructed federal officers on how to carry out their duties. It was a simple directive, really. Not dramatic, not sweeping, just a necessary step to get the government running. No one called it revolutionary. No one protested. It was simply the president doing what the president needed to do. But it opened a door that future presidents would walk through, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly, and occasionally, recklessly. For the first few decades of the Republic, executive orders were rare. Presidents mostly stuck to managing the day-to-day operations of government. They issued proclamations declaring days of Thanksgiving or announcing treaties. They directed military officers. They made appointments. But they didn't try to make law. Then came the Civil War, and with it a president who would redefine the boundaries of executive power in ways the founders never imagined. Abraham Lincoln is often remembered for his eloquence, his sorrow, his steady hand through the nation's darkest hour. But he was also, by necessity, one of the most powerful presidents in American history, and much of that power came not from Congress, but from his own pen. In the early days of the war, with Congress out of session and the Union falling apart, Lincoln acted alone. He suspended habeas corpus, allowing the military to arrest and detain suspected Confederate sympathizers without trial. He ordered a naval blockade of southern ports. He authorized spending without congressional approval. He expanded the military unilaterally. Were these actions constitutional? That's been debated ever since. But Lincoln argued that extreme circumstances demanded extreme measures. The Constitution, he said, was not a suicide pact. If the Union fell, the Constitution fell with it. So he did what he believed was necessary to save both. And then, on January 1st, 1863, he did something even more audacious. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, let's be clear about what this document was and wasn't. It didn't free all enslaved people. It didn't even free enslaved people in the border states that remained loyal to the Union. What it did was declare that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free, which practically speaking meant it freed almost no one immediately, since those areas were still under Confederate control. But symbolically, strategically, it changed everything. It reframed the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a fight to end slavery. It invited formerly enslaved people to join the Union Army, and it dared the Confederacy to continue fighting not just for independence but for the right to own human beings. Critics howled. Some said Lincoln had overstepped, that he had no authority to free anyone, that emancipation was a matter for Congress, or for the states, not for the president acting alone. Lincoln's defense was simple. As commander-in-chief during wartime, he had the authority to seize enemy property, and under the law of the time, enslaved people were considered property. Therefore, freeing them was a military necessity, a way to weaken the Confederacy. It was a legal argument built on a moral atrocity, but it worked, and when the war ended, the 13th Amendment enshrined emancipation in the Constitution, making permanent what Lincoln's pen had started. The Emancipation Proclamation became the template. It showed that a president in the right circumstances, with the right justification, could use executive power to change the country in profound and irreversible ways. But it also raised a warning. If a president could do something this good with a stroke of the pen, could they also do something terrible? The answer, unfortunately, was yes. After Lincoln, the presidency settled back into relative calm. For a while, presidents issued orders here and there, mostly about administrative matters. The government grew, slowly at first, then faster, and with that growth came more complexity, more bureaucracy, and more need for executive direction. Then came the 20th century, and with it crises that demanded action: world wars, economic collapse, the rise of global superpowers. The presidency began to expand, not because the Constitution changed, but because the world did. Theodore Roosevelt, the first modern president in many ways, believed in what he called the bully pulpit, the idea that the presidency was a platform for leadership, for pushing the country forward. He used executive orders to create national forests, to protect wildlife, to regulate businesses. He saw the presidency as a force for good, and he wasn't shy about using it. Woodrow Wilson took it further during World War I, seizing control of railroads and communication systems in the name of national security. It was temporary, he promised. And it was. But it set another precedent. In wartime, the president could do almost anything. Then came Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, a man who would issue more executive orders than any president before or since, over 3,700 of them during his 12 years in office, some mundane, some transformative, and one, tragically, that would stain his legacy forever. In the depths of the Great Depression, FDR took office promising a New Deal for the American people. Congress gave him extraordinary latitude, passing law after law to expand federal power. But when Congress moved too slowly, or when he wanted to act quickly, FDR turned to executive orders. He created agencies. He regulated industries. He put people to work building roads and bridges and dams. He closed banks to stop a panic, then reopened them under federal supervision. He took the country off the gold standard, all by executive action, or with the thinnest veneer of congressional approval. Critics called him a dictator. Supporters called him a savior. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. FDR believed deeply in democracy, but he also believed that democracy needed to be fast and flexible to survive, and in his hands the presidency became the engine of that survival. But then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, and with it, a decision that would haunt the presidency for generations. On February 19, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It was brief, just a few paragraphs. It gave the Secretary of War the authority to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. On its face, it didn't mention race, it didn't mention Japan, but everyone knew what it meant. Within weeks, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast. They were given days, sometimes hours, to pack their belongings. They were sent to internment camps in remote, desolate locations, surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers, not charged with any crime, not given any trial, simply imprisoned because of their ancestry. Families lost everything: homes, businesses, communities, all because a president, in a moment of fear and prejudice, signed his name on a piece of paper. Was it legal? The Supreme Court, in one of its most shameful decisions, said yes. In Korematsu v. United States, the court ruled that the internment was justified by military necessity. Justice Robert Jackson, in a blistering dissent, warned that the decision was a loaded weapon that would sit around ready for any future government to use. He was right. It took decades, but eventually, the country acknowledged the truth. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for the internment and providing reparations to survivors. It was an admission that even in wartime, even with the best intentions, executive power could be catastrophically abused. And yet, the power itself remained, waiting, ready to be used again for good or ill. After World War II, the presidency didn't shrink. If anything, it grew. The Cold War demanded secrecy, speed, and centralized decision-making. Congress, with its debates and delays, couldn't keep up, so presidents kept acting. Truman integrated the military by executive order. Eisenhower sent troops to enforce school desegregation. Kennedy created the Peace Corps. And then came the 1960s and 70s, an era of upheaval, of protests, of distrust. Vietnam, Watergate, a generation losing faith in institutions. Lyndon Johnson used executive power to push forward the Great Society, expanding civil rights and social programs, but he also used it to escalate the Vietnam War, sending more and more troops without a formal declaration of war from Congress. Richard Nixon took executive power to its darkest extreme, not through orders, but through secrecy, through abuse, through a belief that when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. He authorized illegal wiretaps. He tried to suppress the press. He obstructed justice, and when he was caught, when the tapes revealed the depth of his deception, the system finally pushed back. Congress moved to impeach. The Supreme Court ordered him to release the tapes, and Nixon, facing certain removal, resigned. It was a reminder that even the president, the most powerful person in the country, was not above the law, but it was a close call, uncomfortably close. In the aftermath of Watergate, Congress tried to rein in the presidency. They passed the War Powers Act, limiting the president's ability to deploy troops without congressional approval. They created oversight mechanisms. They demanded transparency. But executive power is like water. You can dam it, divert it, slow it down, but it always finds a way through. Ronald Reagan came into office promising to shrink government, but he expanded the use of executive orders. He used them to roll back regulations, to reshape agencies, to advance his conservative agenda. When Congress wouldn't act, he did. Bill Clinton, facing a hostile Republican Congress, turned increasingly to executive orders in his second term. He protected vast areas of wilderness. He imposed gun control measures. He issued directives on everything from labor policy to environmental protection. Critics accused him of ruling by decree. Supporters said he was simply doing his job in the face of congressional obstruction. George W. Bush, after September 11, 2001, used executive power to create new security agencies, to authorize surveillance programs, to detain suspected terrorists without trial. He argued, as Lincoln had, that extreme threats required extreme measures. Barack Obama, frustrated by Republican opposition, famously declared, "I've got a pen, and I've got a phone." He used executive orders to protect undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. He imposed new environmental regulations. He shifted policies on everything from overtime pay to transgender rights. And then came Donald Trump, a president unlike any before him, in style if not always in substance. He took office promising to undo much of what his predecessor had done. And he did. With a flurry of executive orders, he reversed Obama-era policies on immigration, climate, healthcare, and more. He imposed travel bans. He declared national emergencies. He redirected military funding to build a border wall. Some of these actions were upheld by courts. Others were blocked. Some were reversed by his successor. It was a whiplash, a ping-pong match of executive power, each president undoing what the last had done. And now, in 2025, we find ourselves in a new chapter. The current administration continues the pattern, issuing orders, freezing funding, reshaping policy through executive action. The debates rage on, louder than ever. Is this leadership or overreach, necessity or abuse? The answer depends on who you ask. So here we are, more than 2 centuries after George Washington cautiously took up the pen, and the question remains, how much power should one person have? Let's talk about the mechanics for a moment, because executive orders, for all the controversy, are not magic spells. They're bound by rules. Sort of. First, executive orders only have the force of law if they're based on authority granted by the Constitution or by Congress. A president can't just make up new laws. They can direct how existing laws are enforced. They can manage the executive branch. They can issue commands to federal agencies, but they can't create taxes, spend money, or override statutes. In practice, the line is blurry, very blurry. Presidents often justify their orders by pointing to vague constitutional language. The executive power shall be vested in a president. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. What does that mean? Exactly. The Constitution doesn't say. So presidents interpret it broadly, and courts decide, case by case, whether they've gone too far. Congress can also push back. They can pass a law explicitly overriding an executive order. They can refuse to fund its implementation. They can hold hearings, subpoena documents, make life difficult for the administration. But these tools take time, require political will, and often, a willingness to go to war with the White House. Courts are the final check. If someone has standing to sue, if they can prove harm, they can challenge an executive order in federal court. And they do, constantly. Some of the biggest legal battles of the past few decades have centered on executive actions, travel bans, immigration policies, environmental regulations. The courts have blocked some, upheld others, and sent many back for revision. But here's the thing. Even when courts block an order, the president has already made a statement. They've moved the conversation. They've signaled priorities. And sometimes, that's the point. Executive orders aren't just about policy. They're about politics. About showing leadership, or strength, or defiance. About rallying supporters, and provoking opponents. And in an age of deep polarization, where Congress is often gridlocked and compromise feels impossible, executive orders have become the default tool of governance. Why negotiate with the other party when you can just sign your way to action? It's efficient, it's fast, and it's dangerous. Because here's the problem with executive power. It cuts both ways. If your president can do something wonderful with the stroke of a pen, the next president can undo it just as easily. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is stable. Policy swings wildly with each election, leaving citizens, businesses, and communities whipsawed by change. And the more we rely on executive power, the less we rely on the democratic process. Legislation is hard. It requires debate, compromise, persuasion. It's slow and messy and frustrating, but it's also durable. Laws passed by Congress are much harder to undo than orders issued by a president. They reflect, however imperfectly, the will of the people as expressed through their elected representatives. Executive orders bypass all that. They concentrate power in one office, one person, and while that can be a force for good, it can also be a force for tyranny. So what's the solution? How do we balance the need for swift executive action with the need for democratic accountability? The honest answer is, we're still figuring it out. We've been figuring it out for over 200 years, and we're nowhere near done. Some argue for stricter limits on executive power, more congressional oversight, clearer definitions of what presidents can and can't do, sunset clauses that force orders to expire unless renewed by Congress. Others argue the opposite, that the modern world moves too fast for congressional deliberation, that presidents need flexibility to respond to crises, to adapt to changing circumstances, to lead. Both sides have a point, and that's the tension at the heart of American democracy. We want strong leadership, but we fear dictatorship. We want swift action, but we value deliberation. We want change, but we crave stability. The presidency embodies all these contradictions. It's the most powerful office in the world, and yet, it's constrained at every turn, by Congress, by courts, by public opinion, by the Constitution itself. A president can issue an order, but they can't guarantee it will be followed, or funded, or upheld. They can speak with authority, but they can't silence their critics. They can command, but they can't compel. And maybe that's the genius of the system. Not that it works perfectly. It doesn't. But that it forces power to be contested, negotiated, checked. Even the most powerful president in history couldn't do whatever they wanted. Lincoln faced fierce opposition. FDR lost battles in the Supreme Court. Every president, no matter how popular or determined, runs up against limits. The question is whether those limits are strong enough. Let's talk about a concept that's central to all of this: checks and balances. It's a phrase you've probably heard 1,000 times, maybe in a high school civics class, maybe in a news headline. But what does it really mean? The framers of the Constitution were deeply paranoid about concentrated power. They'd lived under monarchy. They knew how easily authority could corrupt, how quickly a leader could become a tyrant. So they designed a system where power was divided, where no one branch of government could dominate the others. Congress makes the laws. The president enforces them. The courts interpret them. Simple, right? Except it's never that simple. Because the Constitution doesn't just divide power, it overlaps it. The president can veto laws. Congress can override the veto. The president appoints judges, but the Senate has to confirm them. Congress controls the budget, but the president decides how to spend it. The courts can strike down laws and orders, but they have no power to enforce their rulings. They depend on the executive branch to do that. It's a web of competing authorities, deliberately tangled, designed to force cooperation and prevent domination. And it works, mostly. But it only works if each branch is willing to defend its own power. If Congress abdicates its responsibility, if it lets the president act unchecked, then the system breaks down. If courts refuse to rule on controversial questions, if they defer too much to the political branches, then the balance tips. If a president ignores court orders, if they flout the law, if they claim authority they don't have, and no one stops them, then the whole structure collapses. This is what worried the framers most. Not that a tyrant would seize power by force, but that power would drift slowly toward one branch, one office, one person, and that by the time anyone noticed it would be too late. So they built in friction. They made governance hard, frustratingly hard, deliberately hard, because they believed that difficulty was the price of liberty. But in moments of crisis, that friction feels unbearable. When the country is at war, or the economy is collapsing, or a pandemic is raging, people don't want deliberation, they want action. And they turn to the president, the only nationally elected official, the person who can speak for the country and act quickly. And presidents, being human, rarely say no to more power. Over time, this dynamic has shifted the balance. Slowly, incrementally, the presidency has grown, not because the Constitution changed, but because circumstances did, and because Congress, often paralyzed by partisanship, has let it happen. There's a name for this: the imperial presidency. The idea that the president has become something the framers never intended, not quite a monarch, but not quite the limited executive they envisioned either. Something in between, powerful, but not accountable, commanding, but not checked. Historians trace this shift to different moments. Some point to the Civil War, when Lincoln expanded executive power to save the Union. Others point to the New Deal, when FDR reshaped the role of government. Still others point to the Cold War, when presidents claimed vast authority over foreign policy and national security, often in secret, often without congressional input. And then there's the modern era, the age of the 24-hour news cycle, of social media, of instant communication. The president is everywhere, all the time. Their words, their actions, their decisions dominate the national conversation in a way that no other figure can match. Congress, with its 535 members, can't compete. The Supreme Court, deliberating behind closed doors, can't compete. The presidency is the sun around which everything else orbits. And that centrality brings power. The power to set the agenda, to define the debate, to shape public opinion. Even when a president can't get Congress to act, even when courts block their orders, they can still move the country simply by speaking, by focusing attention, by making an issue unavoidable. This is the reality of modern American politics. The presidency is not what it was in 1789, and it's never going back. So the question isn't whether the presidency is too powerful. It is. The question is what we do about it. There are no easy answers, no simple reforms that will magically restore balance, but there are ideas, proposals, reforms that, taken together, might help. Some suggest limiting the use of executive orders, requiring presidents to justify each one in writing, subjecting them to automatic review by courts or Congress, creating a public registry so citizens can see exactly what's been ordered and why. Others propose strengthening congressional oversight, giving committees more power to subpoena documents and witnesses, making it easier to challenge executive actions in court, forcing presidents to explain their decisions, not just to friendly audiences, but to skeptical ones. Still others focus on transparency, requiring the executive branch to disclose legal memos justifying their actions, opening up the decision-making process, making it harder for presidents to act in secret, to claim privilege, to hide behind classification. And then there's the simplest, hardest reform of all: voting, electing representatives who will defend their branch's authority, who will push back when presidents overreach, no matter which party they belong to, who will put the Constitution above partisan loyalty. Because ultimately, the system only works if the people in it want it to work, if they value the process more than the outcome, if they believe that how we govern matters as much as what we achieve. And right now, in this deeply divided moment, that's a hard sell. When your side is in power, executive orders feel like leadership. When the other side is in power, they feel like tyranny. We cheer when presidents we support act boldly. We howl when presidents we oppose do the same. This hypocrisy is bipartisan. It's human, and it's corroding the foundations of democratic governance. But here's the thing. Democracy isn't a machine that runs itself. It's a garden. It requires constant tending, weeding, pruning, care. If we neglect it, if we let one part grow wild while others wither, the whole thing becomes unbalanced. And right now, the presidency is overgrown. It's crowding out the other branches, and if we don't trim it back, gently but firmly, we risk losing the garden altogether. Let's take a moment to zoom out, to step back from the details and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't just a story about American politics. It's a story about power, about how we grant it, how we limit it, and how we live with the consequences of both. Every society, every government, faces this tension. How much authority do we give to our leaders? How much freedom do we keep for ourselves? Too little authority, and you get chaos. Too much, and you get tyranny. The trick is finding the balance, and the balance is always shifting, always contested, never settled. What makes the American experiment interesting is that it tries to solve this problem through law, through a written constitution, a separation of powers, a system of checks and balances. It tries to bind power with words, with rules, with institutions. But words can be interpreted, rules can be bent, institutions can be captured, and power, as always, seeks to expand. This is the paradox. We need strong leaders to act decisively in moments of crisis, but we fear what those leaders might do with that strength. We want presidents who can get things done, but we don't want dictators. And so we've created a presidency that is both incredibly powerful and frustratingly constrained. A president can command armies, but can't declare war. They can sign treaties, but the Senate must ratify them. They can issue executive orders, but courts can block them. They can propose budgets, but Congress controls the purse. It's a system designed to be inefficient, to force compromise, to slow down decision-making just enough to prevent rash action, but not so much that the government grinds to a halt. And for most of American history, it's worked, not perfectly, not without grave mistakes and injustices, but well enough to preserve a democratic republic for over 2 centuries, through civil war, world wars, economic collapse, social upheaval. But now, in the early 21st century, that system is under strain. Partisanship is at levels not seen since the Civil War. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. Social media amplifies outrage and rewards extremism. And presidents, empowered by a cult of personality and enabled by a gridlocked Congress, are taking matters into their own hands more than ever. This is a dangerous moment, not because any one president is uniquely threatening, but because the norms that hold the system together, the unwritten rules about how power should be exercised, are fraying. Norms are fragile things. They're not laws. They can't be enforced by courts. They depend on good faith, on shared values, on a collective understanding of how the game is played. And when one side decides the game is rigged, when they stop playing by the old rules, the system starts to buckle. We've seen this happen. Presidents refusing to release tax returns, ignoring congressional subpoenas, attacking judges who rule against them, pardoning allies, firing investigators, claiming absolute immunity, declaring national emergencies for non-emergencies. Each of these acts, individually, might be defensible, might have precedent, might fall within some interpretation of executive authority, but collectively, they represent a shift, a move toward a more authoritarian style of governance, where power is personal, not institutional, where loyalty matters more than law, where the president is not the head of a co-equal branch, but the leader of the nation, above criticism, beyond accountability. And here's the scary part. Once those norms are broken, they're hard to restore, because the next president will remember. They'll see what their predecessor got away with, and they'll push further, and the cycle continues, each administration expanding executive power, each one eroding the constraints a little more, until one day we wake up and realize the system has changed, quietly, gradually, irreversibly. This is how democracies die, not with a coup, not with tanks in the streets, but with a slow accumulation of power in one office, one person, with the normalization of actions that were once unthinkable, with the erosion of checks and balances until they're just decorative, symbolic, powerless. Is America heading down that path? That's the question historians will answer, decades from now, but the warning signs are there, and ignoring them would be foolish. So what do we do? How do we pull back from the brink, if that's where we are? The first step is awareness, understanding how this system is supposed to work, and how it's changing, paying attention, holding leaders accountable, not just with votes every few years, but with constant scrutiny, demanding transparency, asking questions, refusing to accept because the president said so as a sufficient justification. The second step is defending institutions. Congress needs to reclaim its authority. Courts need to enforce limits. The press needs to investigate. Civil society needs to organize. These institutions are not perfect, but they're what stand between us and unchecked power. The third step is rebuilding norms. This is the hardest part, because norms are cultural, not legal. They require a shared commitment to values that transcend partisanship, the belief that winning isn't everything, that the process matters, that today's opposition might be tomorrow's ally, that democracy is more important than any single issue or election. And the fourth step is humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that reasonable people can disagree, that compromise isn't weakness, that the other side isn't evil, just different. These are not easy steps. They require patience, generosity, and a long-term perspective in a world that rewards none of those things. But they're necessary, because the alternative, a presidency unbound, a democracy hollowed out, is too grim to contemplate. Let's talk about something quieter now. Something more personal. Because all of this, all these abstract debates about executive power and constitutional law, ultimately comes down to people, living real lives, affected by decisions made in offices far away, When a president signs an executive order, it's easy to focus on the politics, the partisan battles, the legal challenges, the talking heads on TV, arguing about whether it's good or bad, constitutional or not. But behind every order are human beings, federal workers who have to implement new policies, often with little guidance or resources, immigrants whose lives hang in the balance of a travel ban or a deportation directive, families living near public lands that might be protected or open to drilling, business owners navigating new regulations or the repeal of old ones, soldiers deployed under presidential command, citizens whose rights expand or contract with each new administration. These are the people who live with the consequences of executive power, and their stories are rarely told. Consider the federal employee. There are millions of them, working in agencies across the country. They're not political appointees. They're career civil servants, teachers, scientists, park rangers, postal workers, people who dedicate their careers to public service, often for less money than they could make in the private sector, because they believe in the mission. And then a new president comes in, and with a stroke of a pen, their agency is reorganized, or defunded, or given a new mandate that contradicts everything they've been working toward, and they have to implement it. Even if they disagree, even if it contradicts their professional judgment, because that's the job. This is the reality of executive power. It's not just about grand policy visions, it's about the day-to-day grind of governance, about the people who have to make vague directives work in the real world, about the stress, the confusion, the moral compromises. Or consider the immigrant, someone who came to this country seeking safety, opportunity, a better life, who followed the rules, or tried to, who built a life here, worked, paid taxes, raised children, and then the rules change. A new president issues a new order, and suddenly they're a target, subject to detention, to deportation, to family separation. They didn't break any laws, the law broke around them, changed beneath their feet, because someone in Washington decided that immigration policy needed to be tougher, or more lenient, or just different, and their life, their family, their future became a political football. This is the human cost of executive power used carelessly, or cruelly, or simply without thought for the consequences. Or think about the communities that depend on public lands, small towns near national monuments, Native American tribes with sacred sites, ranchers and farmers and outdoor enthusiasts. For them, a presidential proclamation can mean the difference between preservation and destruction, between economic survival and collapse, between honoring heritage and erasing it. When a president designates new protected areas, or shrinks existing ones, it's not just an environmental issue, it's about livelihoods, about identity, about the future of places that have been home for generations. And here's the thing, these decisions are often made quickly, with minimal consultation, because the power is there, waiting to be used, and presidents, surrounded by advisors with their own agendas, don't always see the full picture, don't always understand what their orders will mean on the ground. This is why transparency matters, why public input matters, why the process of governance, slow and frustrating as it is, matters, because it forces decision-makers to confront the consequences of their choices, to listen to the people who will be affected, to think beyond the political win or the policy goal to the human beings on the other side. But executive orders bypass much of that process. They allow presidents to act quickly, yes, but they also allow them to act without fully understanding what their actions will mean, without hearing from the people who will bear the burden, without considering alternatives. And when those orders are reversed by the next president, which they often are, the whiplash is even worse. Policies swing wildly, programs are created, then dismantled, then recreated. People plan their lives around one set of rules, only to have them change overnight. Businesses invest based on regulatory certainty that evaporates with the next election. This instability has a cost, not just in money, though that's real, but in trust, in the belief that the system is fair, predictable, responsive to something other than partisan politics. And it raises a question that's become increasingly urgent. If executive power can be used to help people, shouldn't we use it? If a president can protect the vulnerable with a signature, stop injustice with a memo, advance the public good with a directive, isn't that what leadership looks like? The answer is yes and no. Yes, because in a broken system, sometimes executive action is the only way to make progress. When Congress won't act on climate change, or gun violence, or healthcare, or any number of urgent issues, should a president just wait? Should they let the perfect be the enemy of the good? Or should they do what they can, within their authority, to make things better? But also no. Because governing by executive order is not sustainable, it's not democratic, and it's not durable. It creates the illusion of progress while undermining the institutions that make real lasting change possible. It's a shortcut, and like all shortcuts, it has a price. The price is legitimacy. When policies are imposed from above, without debate, without buy-in from the public or their representatives, they feel arbitrary, imposed, undemocratic, and that breeds resistance, resentment, a sense that the system is rigged, that votes don't matter, that power is exercised by elites who don't care what ordinary people think. And that resentment, over time, corrodes democracy itself. It fuels populism, extremism, the belief that the only way to fight power is with more power, that the only way to win is to seize control and wield it ruthlessly, before the other side does. This is the cycle we're trapped in. Each side, when in power, uses executive authority to advance its agenda, and each side, when out of power, decries the other as tyrannical. And with each turn of the wheel, the center weakens, compromise becomes harder, trust evaporates, and the presidency becomes less a constitutional office and more a prize to be won, a weapon to be wielded. Breaking this cycle requires something rare in politics: self-restraint, the willingness to say, I could do this but I shouldn't, the discipline to work through the slow, messy democratic process even when it's frustrating, even when the other side is acting in bad faith, even when it feels like losing. Because the alternative is a race to the bottom, a competition to see who can accumulate the most power, who can push the boundaries the furthest, who can do the most damage to the other side before they get their turn. And in that race, democracy is the loser. There's a word that comes up often in discussions of executive power: precedent. It's a legal term, but it's really about something deeper, about respect for history, for continuity, for the idea that what we do today matters tomorrow. Every executive order sets a precedent, not just legally, but culturally. It establishes what's acceptable, what's normal, what future presidents can point to and say, if they could do it, so can I. This is why presidential historians pay such close attention to these actions, not just because they shape policy in the moment, but because they shape expectations for the future. When Harry Truman desegregated the military by executive order in 1948, he set a precedent, not just for civil rights, though that was important, but for the idea that a president could use executive power to advance social justice, even in the face of fierce opposition. That precedent echoed through the decades, influencing how later presidents approached issues of equality and discrimination. When Richard Nixon claimed executive privilege to withhold evidence in the Watergate investigation, he set a precedent, one that the Supreme Court ultimately rejected, but one that presidents since have tested, probed, and sometimes exceeded. The question of what a president can keep secret, and from whom, is still being litigated today. When George W. Bush authorized military tribunals for suspected terrorists after September 11th, he set a precedent, one that raised fundamental questions about due process, about the limits of executive authority in wartime, about how far a president can go in the name of national security. And when Barack Obama used executive action to protect undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children, he set a precedent, one that his successor tried to undo, sparking legal battles that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The question of whether a president can choose not to enforce certain laws, or to enforce them selectively, remains contentious. Each of these actions, in their own way, expanded the boundaries of executive power, not necessarily illegally, not always inappropriately, but cumulatively, they've created a presidency with far more authority than the framers ever imagined. And here's the challenge. Precedents are easier to set than to undo. Once a boundary has been crossed, once an action has been taken, it becomes part of the landscape. Future presidents can point to it. Courts consider it. The public expects it. This is why norms are so important. Because formal checks, constitutional limits are relatively rigid, but norms are flexible. They adapt to circumstances. They allow for nuance, for context, for judgment. A president might have the legal authority to do something, but choose not to because of norms, because of tradition, because of respect for the process. But when norms erode, when presidents stop caring about precedent, when they see constraints as obstacles to be overcome rather than guardrails to be respected, the system changes, quietly, irreversibly. And rebuilding those norms, once broken, is incredibly difficult. It requires leaders who are willing to limit their own power, to say no to actions that might be legal, but are unwise, to think beyond their own term, in office, to the kind of presidency they're creating for their successors. That kind of leadership is rare, especially in polarized times, when every action is judged through a partisan lens, when restraint is seen as weakness and boldness as strength. But it's necessary, because without it, the precedents we're setting today will haunt us tomorrow. Let's return to where we began. The Oval Office. A president. A pen. A document waiting to be signed. It's such a simple image, almost peaceful. The stroke of ink across paper, the press of a seal, the quiet efficiency of executive power. But now, after our journey through history, after seeing how that power has been used and abused, expanded and constrained, we understand what that simple act really represents. It's not just a signature. It's a choice about what kind of leader to be, what kind of presidency to create, what kind of country to leave behind. Every president faces that choice. Some wield the pen boldly, reshaping the nation with broad strokes. Others use it carefully, aware of the weight each signature carries. Some see executive power as a tool to be maximized. Others see it as a responsibility to be borne with humility. And the country, watching, judging, living with the consequences, must decide what kind of presidency it wants, what trade-offs it's willing to accept, what risks it's willing to take. Do we want a president who can act quickly, decisively, even if it means bypassing democratic processes? Or do we want a president who moves slowly, cautiously, even if it means inaction in the face of urgent problems? Do we want a strong executive who can cut through gridlock and get things done? Or do we want a limited executive who respects the separation of powers and defers to Congress? Do we trust the person in the office to use their power wisely? Or do we fear what they might do with it? These are not abstract questions. They're choices we make, implicitly or explicitly, every time we vote, every time we voice support or opposition, every time we decide whether to care about how our government operates. And the answers shape not just individual presidencies but the trajectory of American democracy itself. Because here's the truth. The presidency is what we make of it. The Constitution provides a framework. History provides examples. But ultimately, the office is defined by the people who hold it, and the people who hold them accountable. If we demand transparency, we get it. If we insist on limits, they exist. If we challenge overreach, it can be stopped. But if we don't care, if we're too tired, or too cynical, or too distracted, then power will continue to concentrate, and the presidency will continue to grow, and the balance will continue to tip. This is not a partisan issue. It's not about left or right, Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative. It's about the structure of our government, about the distribution of power, about whether we still believe in the principles that the framers, however flawed they were, tried to encode into our system. Those principles are simple: that power corrupts, that no one is above the law, that authority must be divided to prevent tyranny, that democracy requires not just elections but accountability, transparency, and the rule of law. These principles are under strain, not just from one president, but from decades of drift, of both parties prioritizing short-term wins over long-term stability, of institutions failing to defend their own authority, of citizens tuning out the boring, difficult work of governance. But they're not dead. Not yet. They can still be revived, but it will take work. Attention, care. It will require us to see past the immediate crisis, the latest outrage, the next election, to the deeper question of what kind of government we want to have. And it will require humility. The recognition that we might be wrong, that the other side might have valid concerns, that the system, frustrating as it is, exists for reasons, that shortcuts have costs, that the way we win matters as much as whether we win. This is not a call for passivity, or for abandoning deeply held values, or for pretending that all positions are equally valid. It's a call for balance, for remembering that democracy is not just about getting your way, it's about creating a system where power can change hands peacefully, where minorities are protected, where majorities rule, but not absolutely, where today's losers can become tomorrow's winners without the system collapsing. And executive power, in all its complexity, sits at the heart of that system. It can be a force for good. It can be a tool of oppression. It can be both at once. What it becomes depends on us. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, as your mind wanders through the quiet spaces between waking and dreaming, maybe think about that image, the president, the pen, the paper, and ask yourself, what would you do with that power? How would you use it? What limits would you respect? What precedents would you set? Because in a democracy, we're all responsible. We don't just elect leaders. We shape the offices they hold. We define the boundaries of their authority. We create the norms they follow, or break. And the choices we make, individually and collectively, matter. They echo through history. They shape the world our children will inherit. They determine whether American democracy survives the 21st century, or whether it slowly, quietly transforms into something else. Something more efficient, perhaps, more decisive, more powerful, but also less free, less accountable, less democratic. The pen is powerful, but it's not magic. It's just a tool, and like all tools, it depends on the hand that wields it. May we choose those hands wisely. May we watch them carefully. May we remember that power granted is power that can be abused, and may we never stop asking the question that keeps democracies alive. Who watches the watcher? Who checks the checker? Who holds the powerful accountable? In the end, the answer is simple. We do. All of us. Together. Imperfectly. But necessarily. That's the bargain at the heart of self-governance. Freedom comes with responsibility. Power comes with accountability. And democracy, for all its flaws, beats the alternative. So rest easy. Or rest uneasily, if that's more honest. But rest knowing that the story isn't over. That the struggle continues. That every generation must defend the system anew. And that your voice, your vote, your attention matters more than you might think. The pen and the presidency. The signature and the state. The quiet power of executive action and the loud demands of democratic accountability. These tensions will never be fully resolved. They're woven into the fabric of American government. But that's okay, because in the tension, in the struggle, in the endless negotiation between authority and liberty, we find something worth preserving. A system that's survived civil war and world wars, that's expanded rights even as it's contracted them, that's made terrible mistakes and somehow found ways to correct them, that's stumbled forward, 2 steps ahead and 1 step back, for more than 2 centuries. It's not perfect. It never will be. But it's ours. And it's worth protecting, worth understanding, worth the effort it takes to keep it running, to keep it honest, to keep it democratic. So thank you for taking this gentle journey through the corridors of power, for thinking about questions that don't have easy answers, for caring about how your government works, even when it's complicated and frustrating and deeply imperfect. If you enjoyed this quiet exploration, if it helped you understand a little more about the presidency and executive power, I'd be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed to the channel, or shared it with someone who might appreciate it. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you sleep well. I hope your dreams are peaceful. And I hope when you wake, you'll remember that democracy is not a machine that runs itself. It's a garden that requires tending. And we're all gardeners, whether we realize it or not. Good night. Sleep tight. And may the balance of power rest gently in your thoughts.